Hello my old muckers, and welcome once again as always to another helping of Mr H's Hot Pot. You join me today in my hometown of Wigan, more accurately I'm behind Sheldon Avenue in Standish, which is a small village just outside the town of Wigan. And I've come here today, Hot Potters, to seek out some mining ruins, and we're going to be taking a look at those today. Now before I go any further in this video, I'd just like to give a big shout out to Spiral Dive, who actually found these ruins and made me aware of them through one of his videos. So a big hello to you, sir. Now what Spiral Dive was doing in his video, he was looking for the mythical castle and the seat of King Arthur, which is known as Camelot. I'm not talking about the theme park that's up in Charnock Richard, near where the hotels are, or the former theme park at Charnock Richard, should I say. It's not there anymore. But he wasn't looking for that, he was actually looking for the actual castle, if it existed. And he'd read an article online that supposedly said that it was in Standish of all places. No idea in the truth of that, but unfortunately he didn't find any ruins. What he did find was the ruins of Langtree No.12 Pit, which we'll be taking a look at in a moment. Now because Spiral Dive wasn't from this area, he isn't a local, I think he's from St Helens, he hadn't a clue what he was looking at, but if it wasn't for his video, I wouldn't know about those here today. So a big shout out to you, sir, and I'm going to put a link up to his video now. And anyone out there who's interested in his little bimble looking for the lost castle of Camelot, they can take a look at his video after watching this one, of course. Anyway, we're now going to stick with looking at these mining ruins that he found, as I'm now approaching them. So I'll whip the camera around now and we'll take a look at what remains of Langtree No.12 Pit. So folks, as you can see, behind me there is one of the ruins that we'll be taking a look at today of this former colliery. Now what I'm going to be doing, Hot Potters, we've got quite a bit to get through today because there's quite a few structures that used to sit on this site. I'm going to be using the old sat-nav once again, and I'll be punching in some of the coordinates of where former buildings used to be, and we'll see what remains. Obviously some of them, like in the background there, as you can see, I don't need to do that because they're already there in front of me. Now what that is behind me is the old winding house, and there used to be a winding engine that used to sit on that. But we'll be taking a look at that in a moment. What we're going to start with is what you should start with any colliery, and that's the shaft. So I'll whip the camera around there and we'll take a look at that, shall we? Okay folks, well I'm now doing something that my mother said I should never do, which is stand on one of these cappings over a mine shaft. And I'm stood in the very centre of this mine shaft, which is just marked there by that triangular pillar that you can see in the background. Now this shaft was first sank in 1857 by Thomas Stone, and it was only a small man when he was running it. He had a wooden pit head gear, and I think he linked it up to the Broomfield Colliery, which is on the other side over there of Sheldon Avenue. And nothing remains of that one today, unfortunately, but he did link the two collieries up, and the idea was to create a downcast and an upcast so for ventilation. Before that, he was relying on furnace pits, which I've covered before in other videos. Now, in 1865, the colliery reverted over to Alfred Hewlett, and he chucked his irons in with the Wigan Coal and Iron Company, which was formed later that year. And what the Wigan Coal and Iron Company did, they basically amalgamated and merged a number of collieries to form one big company. And they was hoping that Pearson and Knowles over in the Abram and Ince areas would also join the company, and basically they would have been able to dominate the Wigan coalfield. Unfortunately for them, Pearson and Knowles decided not to join it, and they went their own way. So you had sort of an East Coast and West Coast type of rivalry on the Wigan coalfield. But sticking over here with the Wigan Coal and Iron Company, they pumped in massive amounts of money into this particular colliery. So for Alfred Hewlett, he did a good one really in throwing his irons in with them, being a small colliery owner. And lots of money was pumped into this particular one that was stood at. So much so as they sank the shaft a further 400 yards, and they took it down from the 106 yards that it had originally been sank to 530, and they went through a fault line in the ground, which isn't a good thing when you do that in mining. Anyway, I'm now going to take the camera off the tripod and we'll go commando a little bit and take a look around this former shaft and see what remains, shall we? And here we go, hot potters. Once again, there's the triangular pillar in the centre of the shaft. Just make our way over to it. Now, some of these have this little metal contraption in them, and others don't. I personally think that's for ventilation, although, yeah, it's well blocked that today. But yeah, this shaft would have been capped by the NCB after its formation in 1946, of course. Because what happened with this colliery, it ceased production in 1932, and they just abandoned it. Now, they didn't abandon collieries in the sense that we think. What they basically did, they mothballed them, and there was hoping that eventually fortunes would change and they could reopen them. But it was just left abandoned, so obviously the NCB would have inherited this once they was formed, and they're the ones that capped it to this high standard. But as you can see there, following it all the way around, you can see from the capping just how large this shaft would have been. Now, amazingly, there's still some remnants of the posts that they used to put around these. As I said, they used to put posts around, metal posts, and then they would feed wires through them to stop you going in and doing what I'm doing now. And amazingly, there's one of the original posts still here intact. Not often you see that, hot potters. Not often you see that. Still got some of its original paint on it as well. Yeah, this is the cap shaft. If it gives way now, I'm going to plunge down 530 yards, which is about 400 and odd metres in new money. It's a long way. It'd take me more than a week crawl out, put it that way. Anyway, hot potters, we're now going to make our way over to that brick structure there, which used to be part of the winding house, and we'll take a look at what remains of that. So, hot potters, I'm now stood in front of what would have once been the winding house to Langtree No.12 Pit, and that channel there that you can just see through the trees, that would have once housed a great big winding wheel, which would have been used to pull up the cages and the coal and everything else that was needed to be brought up from the pit bottom. And I'll try and put a photograph in now for you of what one of these winding wheels would have looked like back in the day. I'll put that in for you now. And as you can see, a big wheel was needed to pull up all the weight that would have been needed to have been drawn up from the shaft. We'll make our way up there now, hot potters, and we'll take a look at what it looks like above. Because although the winding house itself has been demolished, the base actually remains where the engine would have been sat. And that, hot potters, is where the wheel would have sat back in the day when this was a winding house. And I'll just pan round here. There you can see the shaft below, where the winding cables would have been fed down to. And it's amazing that this little bit of brickwork, I say little bit, it's quite large actually, has survived. You can see there some bullnose bricks. So it would have been quite a bonny structure in its day. A little bit of reinforcing there, that's quite a bit of reinforcing. Who knows what that would have held. There's a little bit there. It's a bit of a trip trap these days. You can see some more brickwork that's fallen off this structure. We'll make our way up the chamber now where the wheel would have sat. And typically what they used to do with these structures was build them in stone first and then face them off with brickwork. Probably because the stonework was the most expensive part. You can see underneath there. Maybe something would have gone through there, who knows, maybe the axle would have sat through there at one time, because there's a corresponding hole there behind that tree. I mean, sadly this is filled with modern day rubbish today. Obviously, people coming here, playing about as kids. I'm sure this has been a playground for kids back in the 70s. And we're now on top. You can just make out the size of these slabs here. So this engine would have weighed quite a bit. I'll just scramble up there to give you a look at what it looks like from above. But before I do, you can just make out some slots there in that stonework. And this is what it looks like from above. Note to oneself, hot potters, next time I come on and explore like this, I'm going to bring myself some secateurs. So I've just had to climb and make my way through all that. I do suffer for my art. You can see some holes there in these stones. Who knows, maybe that was to key in the blocks that would have been where I'm now stood. Or they held something back in the day. But yeah, this would have been the winding house back in the day. And you can see where it's been faced off with brick. I mean, how I personally think they used to build these winding engines was put this sort of stuff up first and then build the house around it, and then when they wanted to get it out, when they was doing the salvage job, they would probably demolish the house from around it and then get all the scrap out. They wouldn't need to be as careful, would they, doing it in reverse. Anyway, I'm going to make my way back down now. I'll make my way and brave through all them trees, and then we'll take a look around the edge of this winding house. There we go, hot potters, back on terra firma. I won't be climbing up there again in an hurry, I can tell you. I got scratched to smithereens. Now, I do apologise for any wind that might be captured on this particular part of the film. The wind has got up a little bit. Yesterday I come in here doing a recce with little Lucy, my Labrador, and I was lathered, hot potters, as we say here in Wigan, or I was very hot, for those of you who've no idea what being lathered means, because I had a coat on and I had my bob cap on, and the sun was out. Today is totally different, but we'll not let it deter us, we'll push on. So we'll now make our way around the edge of what used to be the winding house, and we'll take a look at the brickwork, shall we? And off we go. As you can see, quite a bit of this has been left behind. It probably was just too difficult to demolish back in the day. Let's make out there some of the buttresses. Lots of broken bricks and things lying about. I made my way up here, back towards the top where I was. And when I came round here yesterday with little Lucy, I did notice a little interesting relic that was left behind on here. I can see lots of bits of stone and other bits and pieces that have been left behind, some of them quite a way away. There's the rear of the winding house. This gives you a better view of how they faced it off with brickwork. Amazing to think, hot potters, that this is still here after all this time. And that little interesting relic is just here. You can probably just make out through the trees there, where there was a set of steps at one time that made your way up through the back and obviously into the winding house. And those have probably been smashed off with a lump hammer. I doubt they was using a jackhammer or anything like that when they took this down, but you never know. Once again, there's the buttresses. I'll make my way back down here and round to the front side of the winding house. Now there was some railway lines that ran down here, according to an old 1800s map that we're using, that ran right along the side of this, down there, and then went on and joined up with the West Coast main line. Look at the size of some of this stonework here. Amazing. And there's another piece of that brickwork. You can see some of the corbelling on that one. You would have thought they would have just used some dynamite to blow these, wouldn't you? But this is the most substantial part of Langtree No.12 Pit. Now I did say I would give you my theories onto why I thought it had a number attached to it. And my theory is that when they threw their irons in with the Wigan Coal and Iron Company, on their portfolio of collieries, Langtree Pit was probably number 12 and the name just stuck, it rolled off the tongue easy. That's why I think it had a number attached to it. I could be wrong. If anybody out there knows differently, please leave a comment below. But we're back at the front of the old winding house now, where the wheel would have sat. And we're going to make our way now to the next relic of this old colliery. So our next little relic that we're going to be taking a look at is the pumping house, which would have just been the other side of the shaft facing the old winding house. And it had an horizontal pumping beam, this particular man, because, like all mines in Wigan, it suffered from the problem of flooding. They all had that problem, basically. Once you get below the water table, water just starts pouring into the mine, so it had to be pumped out. And I'm now making my way over to what remains of the old pump house. And again, there's quite substantial foundations that have been left behind, so I'll whip the camera around now and we'll take a look at them. And here we go. This is the base of the old pump that would have sat here. Once again, you can see lots of reinforcing that would have tied things in and held things in place. Slots there, don't quite know how this would have worked, to be honest. Anybody out there who's more into mining than I am and has a better idea of what an horizontal pumping beam would have looked like, please leave me a comment below with a link, as I'd be fascinated to know how this worked. Let's see the slot there. I'll make my way down here. Hopefully I won't go bum over pap. And who knows what this would have been back in the day. And what those holes would have held. It's certainly been socketed out there at regular intervals, so it's not just randomly placed. But look at how they used to make concrete back in the day. Bits of broken brick called brick bat, and then throw a load of sand and cement with it and hope for the best. Victorian engineering at its finest. Let's make our way to the open end of this beam chamber. And I think, hot potters, that's where it would have sat. Take a closer look. The slots there that would have held something at one time or another. And I should imagine that this was a lot deeper than where I'm currently stood. They've probably pushed the walls in from above and pushed it in on itself, which would help to fill it really. And that there looks like one of the iron posts from round the shaft, doesn't it? That's migrated over here. As I say, you don't see many of them now. Just look at the size of those bricks. That's substantial, isn't it? There's a little bit of a chamber here. A little bit of archway. Who knows where that goes? I'm not going to try and find out either. Probably would have been whatever powered this. Looks like there's been a bit of a collapse there. But yeah, this is where the pump would have sat, on the opposite side of the shaft. Just make my way back round now. Looks like the graffiti artists have been in here. But other than that little bit of graffiti, there's not much in here. It would appear that people don't really come mooching around this area, and that's why it's survived. Anyway, I'm now going to whip the camera around, and we're going to have to break out the old sat-nav to try and find other remains on this site, as these are the only structures that are still standing. Right then, we'll do that now, I think. Now, another modernisation that the Wigan Coal and Iron Company made to this colliery once it merged with their company was to build a brand new boiler house and octagonal chimney which rose 100 feet in the air. And the boiler house was built to house 5 Lancashire boilers, which was needed to power all the gubbins to the winding house and the pumping gear and all that kind of stuff. And it used to stand on this site where I'm currently at. So I'll whip the camera around now and we'll see if we can find any little remains of that chimney and boiler house, shall we? Now sadly today, all that remains of this once magnificent boiler house and chimney is this scrubland. There are a few little bricks and bits of slate etc on the surface, and just make some out there underneath that tree, but other than that there's nothing, sadly. See bits of slate there and some bricks, which is a real shame. Now it would be great to come in here with a tarp team and some heavy lifting gear and excavate this site, as I'm sure you'd be able to find the foundations. I'm sure they didn't dig the foundations out. But yeah, this is where 5 Lancashire boilers once stood to power all the gubbins that was needed to extract the coal from beneath the earth. Let's make our way down here. See if we can see any little remnants, but there's not much of that boiler house. And as you can see from the map, which I showed you earlier, it was quite substantial in size. No, there's just bricks on the surface, that's all. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that there'd been nothing here at one time. Now another feature of this colliery, and near enough all collieries at the time, was a reservoir, which was a large pool of water that would sit on the edge of the colliery site, and it would just stay there in case that it was needed in an emergency, if ever there was a fire, or the powder magazines, which is the little buildings that used to store all the explosives, those caught fire or anything like that. And the reservoir to this one used to sit just over here where I'm making my way to now. There isn't very much left of it today because the farmers' fields that surround this little wooded area have slowly encroached on this former colliery site, as I believe it's taken over where the magazines used to sit. But although we'll go and take a look at the area where they once stood, but there's nothing there anymore, it's beneath the farmer's field. But there is a little bit of the reservoir left, and it's just through these trees here, so I'll bob down now, make my way through, and I'll show you what's left of the old reservoir to this colliery. And this, hot potters, is all that's left of the former reservoir to this colliery. Just make out the edge there to it. You can see the shape. It's been square at one time. Obviously the land's eroded over time. You can just make out a metal post there that would have probably fenced off this body of water to stop anybody falling in it. It would have been much bigger than this, and it would have extended into the farmer's field beyond. But as I said earlier, the farmer has slowly encroached onto this former colliery site. Now I've no idea if reservoirs were actually mandated by an Act of Parliament that every colliery had to have one, but near enough all the collieries in the local area that I've visited of Wigan had one of these. Anyway, we'll move on now and we'll take a look in the field and we'll see if we can see the area where the powder magazines used to stand. Now this former colliery had two powder magazines that was located along the edge of its property boundary. The first one I'm now approaching, and I'll show you on the map now, which is close to where the reservoir used to be. And I'll whip the camera around for you in a moment and we'll see what remains on the surface. There's not a lot to see of this building, sadly, but we can see on the surface one or two bricks which give the game away that something used to be here. And this, hot potters, is the area where, according to my sat nav, the first of those powder magazines would have sat. Now, as you can see today, it's just a farmer's field, and it would appear that nothing remains. But if we take a closer look, we'll be able to see one or two bricks that have been brought to the surface from those structures. Some more bricks over there. I do apologise for the wind, we are right out in the open here. And some more bricks and remains over there. I'm now going to make my way around to where the other one used to be, which is by following the edge of the field round there, and hopefully we'll be able to find a few more bits and pieces from the powder magazines that used to stand there. Now, for those of you who don't know what a powder magazine is, it was a little building, a small structure that was built to house all the explosives that they would use, or the firemen would use, underground. And we're making our way around now to where the second of the powder magazines used to stand. I am now coming up to bricks on the surface again, so we mustn't be far from it. So I'll whip the camera around and we'll take a look at what remains, shall we? Now, according to form, it should be round here somewhere, hot potters. You can just see Langtree Hall there in the distance. And that house has a moat around it. This probably is their land. We'll soon find out because I'm honing on their view now. But we'll make our way around here and we'll see what we can find. Yeah, lots of bricks on the surface here. My guess is those are from the old magazine building. Now, there is a bit of a depression here by the side of the field. Whether or not that was part of where it would have once stood or not, Who knows? But it just shows you that once man brings a structure onto the land, it's very hard to remove all traces of it. Somewhere beneath our feet are the foundations to that building. Right then, I'm going to make my way back whence we came. We'll take a look at where the mineral railway lines used to run, and then I think we'll wrap this video up. Okay folks, well I'm now studying what's left of the old mineral railway line at the colliery end. As you can see in the background there's a brick wall that would have formed part of the embankment to this railway cutting. There's not a great deal of it left today because it appears that once they demolished the colliery buildings such as the winding house and the pump house, they pushed the rubble into this cutting. Obviously it was a ready-made ditch for them, wasn't it, so they could get rid of the rubble. Now the railway line would have gone from where I'm stood, it would have headed off in front of me, and it would have veered left and slowly made its way towards Bradley Hall Industrial Estate. And from there it would have linked up with the West Coast Main Line, and the coal would have then been taken to wherever it was needed. But we're going to whip the camera around now, take a look at what remains in this railway cutting, and then, as I say, we'll wrap this video up. And this is that little bit of railway wall that forms part of the embankment here. You can just make it out there through the trees. And there's the rubble that's filling in this railway cutting. You can clearly see that it would have gone through there at one time up to where the shaft and the winding engine house was. I'm going to make my way slowly through the trees. Why is it with old former railway cuttings the ground beneath them is always boggy? It's an interesting little point, that. Obviously it's sort of a natural canal once they've built it, isn't it? I'm now going to have to slowly merge little clips of this walk along this former railway cutting, because as you can see there's fallen trees and things blocking the way. We're now over that tree and just continuing along. The wall's petered out though, it's just a natural embankment now. And I wonder if the tracks are still underneath all this, or whether they were lifted for scrap. I should imagine that they was lifted for scrap, really. And eventually this will take us right up to the backs of the houses. And there's a modern day sewerage system that's been placed into the former track bed of this railway cutting. No idea where that goes. It's amazing to think that this is still here after all this time. I'll slowly make my way over to those trees there, and I think that's where our journey ends, Hot Potters. And here we are, Hot Potters. Not far from where our journey ends. Lots of modern day rubbish has found its way into this little wooded area. And some of the things that you find in places like this, you wonder how they've got here. But yeah, this is where the railway would have made its way slowly, started to head left off towards Bradley Hall. I think there's still a little bit of the railway cutting wall just through those trees there. We'll just take a look at that. And then, as I said, I think we'll wrap this video up, because it's going to be a bit of a long one, this, Hot Potters. There was a lot to see. And there is the edge of the railway cutting. Obviously it would have been a lot deeper than this. It's filled in over the years. There's the farmer's field up there and beyond. Well, that's the edge of the old railway cutting that used to serve the colliery. And something as I've found out, Potters, will end on a bit of a nostalgia note, is what appears to be an old Bears pop bottle that's been discarded here in the woods. And we'll get a rough age of that pop bottle from the deposit that's on the cap. So I'll whip the camera around now and we'll take a look at that bottle, and I think we'll wrap this video up from here. Yes, Hot Potters, indeed it is a Bears pop bottle, dating from around the late 70s, early 80s. And the reason I know it dates from the late 70s, early 80s is the deposit on it was 10p. Took a few of those back in my time, Hot Potters, for a little bit of pocket money, I can tell you. I wonder if I take it back to the shop, I'll get me 10 pence for it. Doubt it, they'll probably sling me out there. But proof, Hot Potters, if ever proof was needed that things were bigger back in the 70s and 80s. I think they reduced the size of the pop bottles bars now. They're only, I think, 750 centilitres, something like that. But yeah, a little bit of nostalgia. I'll just put that back without smashing it. But that'll just about do it for today, Hot Potters. I hope you've enjoyed today's little video, taking a look around what remains of Langtree No.12 Pit here in Standish in my hometown of Wigan. Big thank you once again to Spiral Dive for finding this location and sort of making me aware of it through one of his videos. I'll leave a link in the description below, and be sure to go and check out his video and enjoy his little bimble. Right then, I'm out of here. I'm going to head off back home now, and I'm going to edit up this video ready for your edification as always. So, until the next time, from myself, Mr H, it is, bye-bye for now.